Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Loder. I'm the Healthcare Policy Editor at The Economist, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today to this event, produced in collaboration with On Think Tanks and Southern Voice. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to welcome a wonderful panel of health and economic policy researchers and consultants. They're joining us today from Sri Lanka, Ghana and Colombia and the UK. To discuss the challenges and opportunities that are posed by the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines around the world. Just to set the context, the coronavirus pandemic has claimed 3 million lives so far. It has also cost millions more their jobs and livelihoods, and we're still trying to calculate the effects of long COVID. In doing so, the pandemic has exposed very deep systematic political, health, racial and economic inequalities across the world. Now, vaccine programs are giving hope, but the rollout so far has been unequal. High and middle income countries have been able to secure vaccines. Low income countries are very much reliant on external supply and funding and are being left behind. The World Health Organization has criticized what it describes as a shocking imbalance in the distribution of coronavirus vaccines between rich and poor countries. And we know that in order to achieve safe, effective and equitable access, vaccines need to be produced at scale, priced affordably and allocated well globally. So we need a coordinated, cooperative international response. So what are the challenges? How can we try to rise to them? And how can we use this opportunity as well to create more resilient healthcare systems and strengthen our approach to pandemic response in the future? So with me today is Dr. Fenny, Dr. Dushni Weerakoon, Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner, and Dr. Carlos Felipe Escobar. And they're going to talk with us. And let me just introduce these speakers one by one. Dr. Fenny is a Senior Research Fellow with the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economics Research at the University of Ghana. She is a West Africa Global Health Leaders Fellow at the Centre on Global Health Security in Chatham House. Amma has a PhD in Health Economics from the Department of Public Health, Aarhus University, Denmark, and an MSc in Health, Population and Society from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome. Dr. Dushni Weerakoon is Executive Director of the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka and Head of its Macroeconomic Policy Research. Her research and publications cover areas related to macroeconomic policy, regional trade integration and international economics. She has extensive experience working in policy development committees of the government of Sri Lanka, working as a consultant to international development organisations and serving as a director on the boards of corporate and academic entities in Sri Lanka. Dushni has a BSc in economics from Queen's University Belfast and an MA and a PhD in economics from the University of Manchester. Welcome to you too. Dr. Mark Eccleston-Turner is a lecturer at law at Keele University and has been funded by the AHRC to investigate how vaccines might be fairly and equitably distributed around the world. His research interests lie in the field of pandemic preparedness and access to vaccines and the law of international organisations in the context of global health. He has published extensively on access to pandemic vaccine issues, including on issues of vaccine procurement for developing countries and equitable access models. Welcome. Last but by no means least, we have Dr. Carlos Felipe Escobar, an independent higher education consultant and coordinator at INOS, Colombia. INOS is a joint initiative of AFIDRO and the Universidad del Bosque to contribute to the national dialogue on health based on scientific knowledge and innovation with a look to the future. INOS's aim is to connect knowledge and thinking of scientists, academics, experts and innovators in health to find solutions to the challenges faced by public policymakers, the community and agents of the health system in Colombia. Welcome to you too. Well, what an exceptional panel we have with us today. So first of all, let's talk about access to vaccine. We have a situation, of course, where high and income countries are doing well, and it's very much more mixed picture elsewhere. We need to suppress the virus globally. So let's talk about our strategy for doing so far. I wondered if I could start with perhaps Dushni. Could you tell us a little bit more about COVAX and what it's intended to do, please?
As far as I understood from what the COVAX initiative was meant to ensure that there was some degree of equitable access to vaccines for the low-income countries. And the intentions behind the initiative is to ensure that at least 20% of our populations get vaccinated before the broader sort of populations in more richer countries are able to access and get themselves vaccinated. So the intentions behind that initiative was good. It was soliciting funds from donors and multilateral agencies, etc. But my sense is that aside from the funding, getting adequate supplies of vaccines has been the problem. So in my part of the world, in South Asia, for instance, COVAX has really not had any major impact in terms of making vaccines available so far. So to date, that initiative has really not worked in terms of its original objectives.
I wonder if I could turn to you, Mark. You have quite a lot of expertise on equitable distribution of vaccines. Could you tell me how you rate the attempt to use COVAX so far, and how you think it's doing?
So I think it's important to recognise that COVAX essentially had two aims. So COVAX is part of the ACT accelerator from WHO. And it has two aims, essentially. The first is to accelerate the research and development of vaccines for COVID-19. And the second is to act as a procurement agent, purchasing vaccines and distributing them to low and middle income countries primarily. On the first strand, I think we can say that COVAX has been a success. We have vaccines, the leg time of development with the COVID-19 vaccine is the fastest ever vaccine developed. Under a year from discovery of virus to vaccines in arms. That's an extraordinary achievement. And that comes about through COVAX, but also multilateral agencies and governments around the world heavily subsidizing vaccine manufacturers to do research and development into COVID-19 vaccines, to provide an economic incentive to research into this area and to accelerate research into this area. What COVAX has been a lot less successful at doing is successfully procuring and distributing those vaccines around the world. And as it currently stands, the United Kingdom government has distributed more vaccines in the UK than COVAX has distributed globally. But also, when we look at the target which COVAX set itself, 20% vaccine coverage in low and middle income countries around the world. If the UK government, by the end of this year, if the UK government had set itself a target of 20% of the UK population immunized by the end of this year, that would have been considered quite a low target for us to hit. So there was inequity in the target, never mind in the execution of the target. But it's very clear that the execution of the target is going to be missed. It doesn't appear that COVAX is going to distribute anywhere close to the number of doses which are required to immunize 20% of the world's population.
Emma, I wonder if I could ask you, I know that Ghana was one of the first countries, in fact, it was the first country, I think, to get distribution of vaccines from COVAX. What's the view of COVAX in Ghana, and on the extent to which it's felt that the country can rely on COVAX to supply its vaccine needs?
Thank you very much. So around January, we were very much aware that we're going to be part of this COVAX facility. And by February, we had about 600,000 doses coming. As we speak, the second dose was supposed to have been released 2 weeks ago for those who had the first-time doses. But we've been told that there's been a delay by a month because there's still no vaccines in sight, really. And so reflecting on that and what it means for the rest of the country, because this is just 600,000 doses, and there are almost 17 million, adults who are capable of being vaccinated, waiting on the sidelines. So again, you just see how huge the challenge is, and there's really no guarantee that we'll have half of the population vaccinated, as the government said, when the COVAX facility actually rolled out in February. So these are some of the things that we are reflecting on now.
And thank you. And Carlos, could you perhaps give me some reflection on what the view is in your part of the world, in Colombia, and perhaps in the region as well?
Yeah, of course. Well, I would say that first I would like to highlight that COVAX is, I think, that a very, very, very innovative approach to these kind of challenges. And the first thing that I would like to highlight of this effort, both of Gavi and CEPI and the World Health Organization, is that it's a very, very, very powerful tool. The fact that it has not give to this date the number of let's say deliveries that we would like to have, I would say it should not be the matter of concern. I think that a program of this kind in which you put together people supporting from different let's say grounds like let's say private donors, but also public donors and states, let's say rich states helping to finance access to emerging countries and less low-income countries. It's a very, very interesting development in terms of cooperation. So the big question, if in my point of view, should be how we can strengthen and make it work faster and better. In my country, we have already received a very important number of COVAX vaccine, and I think that at least regarding the I would say deep research that the World Bank presented last week about COVAX and some strategies aiming to finish the pandemics in March 22. I think that we should join forth in this way. I think that definitely trying to support the tools and the strategies that COVAX has placed in the playing field of health, it's very, very, very important. You know, at this stage, what we have with the funding that COVAX has had, we would get, let's say, around 16% of population vaccinated. The initial target, as Mark mentioned, was 20%. So very close to get this point. And in the economic projections of the additional funding to reach a 30% covering would be needed an additional 4 billion. So this 4 billion does not seem to be a huge amount as related to the cost that COVID and being late in this process is supposing to every economy. And this definitely seems to be the fastest way in which we can really get the targets we can. So I think that we need to raise awareness on what COVID and the power that COVID can provide to solve these issues in the fastest time that we want, and make the question put it in the process of what needs to be done to be working. There are things that we need to solve relating logistics and distribution, related trade and export. Let's say so. Let's try to focus on this. But in any case, I think that this is a highly innovative, collaborative, and focus on equity mechanism that I think we need to embrace and recognize and celebrate.
All right, then, so let's try and unpick a little bit what are the supply challenges really for low-income countries and why perhaps COVAX hasn't been able to obtain doses. Dushni, I wonder if you could talk to me about why it is rich countries have managed to kind of sew up so much of the vaccine supply.
Well, my understanding was that COVAX was in some sense supposed to source the vaccines and then ensure that the access is a little bit more equitable. But in practice, what I think has happened is that countries have pre-ordered vaccinations in dealing directly with the vaccine manufacturers. And at the initial outset, when there was still some uncertainty about the efficacy of the vaccinations that were being produced, they tended to hedge their bets and order vaccines well in excess of what was required. So to us, coming from middle-income, low-income country perspective, it seems that the financial resources were there. Richer countries were able to therefore place orders well ahead of the developing countries. And when you look at the available data today on the share of available vaccines that have already been pre-ordered, you can see that the advanced countries have got more than, something in the range of 55 to 60% of available stocks have been pre-ordered by advanced countries. And the share for the middle and low income countries is around 15%. So we started from, in some sense, from a disadvantaged position, and quite frankly, it's getting worse because, as Amar mentioned, even the case is similar here, that with the available vaccine producers, developing countries also joined the queue, ordered their stocks, but then there have been further supply disruptions, and those stocks have not materialized. So even in Sri Lanka, we went through the same experience that Ghana has obviously gone through, of having gone through one dose of vaccinations, and then we don't have supplies for the second follow-up dose.
Very concerning. So Mark, I wonder if you could perhaps provide a different perspective on this. I mean, rich countries have basically pre-ordered it all. That's the problem.
Essentially, yes. High-income countries have made use of what are called advanced purchase agreements. So around a year ago from now, when vaccine research was beginning, high-income countries negotiated these advanced purchase agreements that stated, in the event you make a vaccine which is manufactured and licensed, we will purchase X amount of them for this amount of money, and we want to have priority access. So these agreements were seen to be used in 2009 H1N1 as well, which allowed a very small number of high-income countries to dominate access in this way. So whilst high-income countries like the UK and the US and Canada and so on were negotiating these agreements to get themselves into a priority position, COVAX didn't even exist at that time. We were still trying to sort out the governance structures of how COVAX would operate, trying to raise funds for it to try and begin purchasing. So COVAX was quite slow off the mark and was already behind high-income countries who had a wealth of experience of negotiating these sorts of agreements, but also had the large amount of capital ready to go to negotiate and purchase these vaccines through these advanced purchase agreements. So one of the problems was that we hadn't already set up a COVAX in peacetime, for want of a better word. We knew a pandemic would happen in the future. We knew vaccines would be the route out of it. We knew high-income countries would dominate procurement because that's what they did in 2009. And in that peacetime, we didn't do anything to make sure a system like COVAX was already in place to purchase and distribute vaccines quickly to low and middle-income countries.
Another factor that I wonder is part of this is that wouldn't it also be fair to say that a lot of low-income countries were less interested in the first two vaccines out of the gate, Pfizer and Moderna, and were kind of hoping that the AstraZeneca vaccine would be the vaccine of choice because it was cheaper and easier to distribute. I wonder if I could ask you, Amma, would that be a fair thing to say that actually, Ghana was more looking towards the Astra vaccine as a sort of vaccine of choice than perhaps the Pfizer or Moderna?
Yes. So reflecting on how this whole thing has transpired, when the initial vaccines came out, we knew that logistically we were not ready for such. We are talking about temperatures less than 2 degrees Celsius, and we don't really have the capacity to deal with such infrastructural demands of those kinds of vaccines. And so definitely Astra was the way to go. And again, because it was cheaper And we know right from the start of the pandemic, we've had to rely on World Bank facilities to even do testing and contract tracing and all the other processes that have gone on. So a lot of funding issues have been part of this story. And the fact that we were really late on the table when it came to negotiations, because at that point we had also other challenges facing us as nations. Our economies were also struggling. I mean, Ghana's economic growth, contracted by almost 6% at that time. So you have all these different challenges being faced, and really vaccines were not the focus at the time. Other countries were going forward with these negotiations. But now we realize that we needed to have done this earlier. Unfortunately, COVAX came in a bit too late, and we can see the effects of that now.
I mean, with hindsight, would you have thought that perhaps a bilateral arrangement between Ghana and another country would have been a good idea? Or perhaps should the African Union have formed its vaccine task force sooner?
Yes, so the CDC, African CDC, and really the African Union has been very vocal and very phenomenal in getting us to this point. And really, right from the start, there was this concerted effort to work together as a continent and not just one country. So then we enjoy economies of scale, bigger markets, bigger voices, bigger bargaining power. So a lot was left on the shoulders of AU, for example, and the negotiations really were a bit late with that model, I would say.
If we're sort of homing in a bit then on the Astra vaccine as being one of the kind of vaccines of choice for global distribution, then I think probably we need to turn to talk about what's happening at the largest supplier of this vaccine to low-income countries, which is the Serum Institute in India. And this company has had to cut exports abroad. The government has forced it to do so. And that has meant that COVAX is very short of doses. Mark, I wonder if I could turn to you and perhaps also to Dushni. Let me just ask, what's the impact, Dushni, of India's rising domestic need for vaccine on other countries?
It's quite huge, frankly, and I think again, pretty much the same experience that even here in South Asia, we waited for the AstraZeneca because the logistics of some of the other vaccines for storage and refrigeration, all of that seems just quite complex. So, for instance, the initial contribution from COVAX initiative came in, and then India had its neighborhood sort of, vaccine diplomacy is what we call it. They donated about 500,000 doses of vaccines to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka, to Nepal at the outset, and most of these countries had then placed orders with the Serum Institute, and I think cost factors also played a role in that. Unfortunately, and quite understandably now, as India's COVID situation has sort of escalated dramatically, India is diverting whatever supplies it has to its own citizens, and the impact on the rest of the countries that had placed these orders is that now we're scrambling around trying to look for alternative vaccines. And sort of the preferred vaccines have been the Russian vaccine, etc. So it is somewhat of a waiting game, and I think to some extent also it undermines confidence of local populations in terms of the vaccinations, because when too many vaccination options are thrown open, people start to speculate, well, is this good? Is it bad? Who has approved it? So I think the uptake also to some extent gets impacted because of that process.
Thank you. And so, Mark, I think, when we think about, contracts being overridden by national governments in times of crisis like this, I mean, do we need to kind of rethink our trade regulations? I mean, is there some kind of are there some kind of pandemic rules that need to apply when we start talking about the kind of vital health goods that need to move around the world during a health crisis like this?
I think the international system doesn't necessarily have a solution to that problem. We're talking about the internal sovereignty of a country, and the WTO or the WHO are going to really struggle to actually place any restrictions on that internal sovereignty. The fundamental problem comes down to a limited global supply. A limited manufacturing capacity, and it's limited in two senses of the word. It's limited in two senses. In the first sense, it's limited in that we cannot produce enough doses to satisfy our global demand right now. And secondly, the manufacturing capacity is limited geographically. There are very few manufacturing plants around the world which are actually able in terms of technological sense, but also in a legal sense, to manufacture these doses. So the manufacturing platform which the AstraZeneca vaccine uses, the recombinant adenoviral vaccine, there is manufacturing capacity around the world on that manufacturing plant. But the problem was the University of Oxford partnered exclusively with AstraZeneca, and AstraZeneca have only sub-licensed the right to manufacture this vaccine to the Serum Institute in India, which means that actually we have a very limited global manufacturing capacity now, which is largely based in the US, the UK, a bit in Belgium, but largely through the Serum Institute in India. The Serum Institute in India is the world's largest vaccine manufacturer, has a wealth of experience in this field. But the problem is, if you place so much of your emphasis on manufacturing in one facility or in one country, if that manufacturing capacity gets cut off for whatever reason, and in this case, we're talking about export controls, then that can have huge global ramifications. What we need is a diversification of manufacturing capacity, both in terms of who makes it and where it's made.
But I mean, as I understand it, AstraZeneca had licensed it to about 9 locations, which is quite a lot considering in the year that they had available, wouldn't you say?
Well, the problem was that the exclusivity part came at the Oxford AstraZeneca level. There were discussions in the early stages, as far as I understand it, that actually this manufacturing would go open source rather than be given as an exclusive license to AstraZeneca, and therefore anyone with the platform technology would have a license and permission to manufacture the Oxford jab. If that had been the case, we may be in a situation where we had a much larger manufacturing pool from which to procure from.
And then how would the tech transfer have worked? Because Astra would have, or Oxford would have had to sort of, essentially transfer the cell lines and the ability to make it. I mean, that presumably would also have had to have been done.
Yes, yeah, that would have required transfer of technology, absolutely, which is one of the two impediments to manufacturing at the moment. I know that you have become interested in the IP element of it, which I'm sure we're going to come on to discuss. And essentially, there are two possible impediments here. The first is intellectual property, and the second is transfer of technology. And we need a solution which addresses both of those impediments where they exist.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come on to that in a bit. And so what you're saying really, though, is also that regionally, we just don't have enough manufacturing facilities around the world. And that's obviously been something that's been a problem in Africa, which just does not have really any such manufacturing facilities and has relied very much on India. Anna, I wonder if I could ask you to talk about this thought that has now arisen in many countries across Africa and within the CDC. I know John Nkengasong is pushing this, that it really is long past time for Africa to invest seriously in vaccine manufacturing on the continent. Tell me a bit more about this idea and how it might work.
Yes, so a lot has happened, and this is catch-up time for Africa, really. Because way back in 2007, there was a manufacturing plan to specifically boost the pharmaceutical industry. The idea was to build a local capacity of the pharmaceutical industries across the continent. So this plan was there in 2007. Many member states ignored it or did really little to facilitate that partnerships. And now we are faced with a situation where 99% of our vaccines are imported. And it's a sheer volume of immunization coverage gaps that we are dealing with. We also have issues to do with regulations, standards, and the investment in manufacturing itself, we know it's a very huge margin, and the barriers, non-trade barriers, trade barriers are extensive. So right now there's an appetite for countries to start pushing local manufacturing. And again, we have to do it as a continent because we are talking about moving at scale, encouraging investors to come because they can see their investments yielding profits. And so there's a lot of appetite right now for local manufacturing. I think Africans do not want to be the last in the line again. I mean, for such pandemics. We've had Ebola. Ebola, thankfully, was restricted to 3 countries in West Africa, but it should have given us some sense of urgency to prepare for a time like this, and somehow we missed the opportunity. So again, COVID gives us that opportunity to start looking internally at what we can do, and there's been a lot of push, a lot of discussion about it. And recently, the Africa CDC, supported by African Union, has had an MOU with CEPI to start boosting investments in R&D and manufacturing in Africa, and then encourage more clinical trials here as well. We just have 2% of clinical trials globally being done in Africa. And so the gaps are really wide and a lot can be done.
Carlos, I wonder if I could ask you about local manufacturing. Is this something that is seen as being more of a priority now since the COVID-19 pandemic in Latin America?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Mark put it very clear. We have a very small global capacity of manufacturing concentrated in just a few countries. So, of course, it should be a global concern to build capacities everywhere in every region and explore different mechanisms in which these manufacturing capacities could be set in place as soon as possible. I'm afraid that it would be difficult to think that they will be ready for this moment. I think that definitely, at least what has shown and in the let's say projections on the building capacity, etc. It's shown that trying to start from zero, building these manufacturing capacities in different regions will not be in time, and that if we want to get this target that we have of 60% of the global population vaccinated, to get the global immunity moment, definitely is supporting the process right now, and trying to move them faster seems to be the best choice. And let me highlight, because also one of the things that are very important is the kind of shortage that we are experiencing in raw materials and that needed for the vaccine production. Around 100 today, around 100 of these materials are getting in shortage in different regions. For example, for the production of mRNA vaccine, some lipids are absolutely necessary for the production, and there is a shortage in this. So we have to understand this because definitely making easy the export and import, and involving World Trade and World Customs organizations to make things work definitely flawlessly in this issue is also absolutely necessary. And as well, we're having something like biases and vials and many other supplies that definitely are necessary. I think that also understanding that we need to integrate not only the vaccine point. The vaccine is just a point in the whole issue, but we are having, for example, in emerging and developing countries, big issue related to the logistical of the vaccine, and that's why we could have some vaccine, and I think that Dushni touched that point, or Amy, we can have some vaccine, but if we don't have the logistics to guarantee the freeze of the whole chain, we are going to lose everything. So I think that approaches like the one that we have had from the accelerator, which COVAX is part of this, and also all other initiatives like PIPES are very important, because they are understanding the process in a comprehensive and I would say chain value model, rather than just a single and punctual intervention in vaccine. This is not a vaccine issue. This is a whole health issue that involves many more components to move ahead in the way we want to move. Here in the region, definitely there are initiatives. We recently have, and it's still in discussion, an act that is proposing a new, let's say, big pharma public-based facility that should be, let's say, set in place, and that should guarantee pharmaceutical security. That has been the, let's say, the idea, and that to provide big funds to this, the capacities for research, knowledge transfer, development, they should involve in the logistic and distribution, etc. We are very, let's say, aware of these kind of initiatives, because if something has shown us pandemic is that the speediness of response that we got in research and development and having the solution was incredibly huge, and was not based in, let's say, this sort of big public-based and government-based laboratories, but in the way we involved both private and public efforts in trying to move that.
Yes, that's very interesting. Thought it was interesting that you picked up on the kind of very stretched global supply chains, because when you talk to the sector, people who work in the industry, about what can be done to increase the production of vaccines, they point to shortages of raw material and ingredients, and they say that, you know, they've expanded from 3 billion to potentially 10 to 14 billion, and that's what's limiting global vaccine supply. However, there is a contrasting argument which is saying, no, actually, IP is really the limiting factor here. And if we were to waive IP rights, that actually we could boost vaccine production. Mark, I wonder if I could turn to you and tell me, you know, what this discussion is about, a TRIPS waiver. Can you explain what that is and why you think it's necessary?
Sure. So it's first of all important to recognize what a patent is. So a patent is a legal right, and it's an exclusionary right. It's the right to prevent other people from doing things with your technology. So if I hold a patent over something, it prevents you from making that patented product for a set period, 20 years typically. Now, the TRIPS agreement is the World Trade Organization multilateral agreement in respect of intellectual property, which says that patents must be available on pharmaceutical products for a minimum of at least 20 years. So all members of the WTO are legally obliged to offer intellectual property protection in their territory for at least 20 years. And we have seen previously that intellectual property has posed a significant barrier to access to medicines, particularly antiretrovirals for HIV. And in those circumstances, it was very clear that patents were the predominant barrier. But vaccines are different. It's important to recognize that. So when it comes to making drugs, oral solid tablets that you take, you know, the antiretrovirals people living with HIV take, or the paracetamol you took before we went on this call because you had a bit of a headache, they are really quite simple to make. And the only thing that stops generic manufacturers around the world from making carbon copy replicas of you know, any antiretroviral or any oral solid drug is intellectual property. That's the only barrier that's there. Vaccines are different. Vaccines are very complex things. There's limited manufacturing capacity around the world, and it's not like making drugs. vaccines are biologicals. They're large biological materials, and they're quite complex to make. And you need specific experience and specific technology in order to work the materials. Now, when it comes to the technology which we're talking about for COVID-19 vaccines, it is likely that both intellectual property and technology poses a barrier here. One thing we do know is that the platforms which these vaccines are made on, the mRNA platform and the adenoviral vaccine platform for the AstraZeneca vaccine, do contain a multitude of intellectual property protections. Now, what the TRIPS waiver, so there was a proposed TRIPS waiver from South Africa and India. Now, what that proposes to do is to give member states of the World Trade Organization permission to waive those intellectual property protections in their territory, in order to give what we call legal certainty to vaccine manufacturers. So when we're talking about the mRNA vaccine, for example, there are hundreds of different patents over this technology. And you need to have a legal team which can wade through each one of these patents which has been filed in your territory, work out which one is and which one is not directly relevant to your vaccine manufacturing, negotiate an agreement to license and use that technology with the patent holder across a range of technologies in order to make one mRNA vaccine. Now, that takes time, that takes a lot of legal expertise, and it's difficult. And if just one of those negotiations fail, you no longer have permission to make mRNA vaccines in your territory. What a TRIPS waiver would do would give legal certainty, would say, don't worry about those negotiations. Don't worry about wading through these vast patent thickets to find out what is and is infringement in this territory. Get on with manufacturing. You're not going to get sued, because you might be in a circumstance where there might not be a patent for an mRNA vaccine filed in Sierra Leone. There may be, there may not be. But what we need is a hypothetical manufacturer based in Sierra Leone to know that if they start manufacturing mRNA vaccines tomorrow, they're not going to get sued for it because they didn't miss an mRNA patent application. So what we're worried about in law is what's called the chilling effect, where even if it's not illegal for you to do something, where you go, actually, I'm a bit worried, I might have missed something in the landscape, I just won't risk it. What the TRIPS waiver will do is give that legal certainty to manufacturers that they have the lawful permission to use this technology in their territory. Now, just a TRIPS waiver and just removing those IP impediments will not allow a manufacturer in Sierra Leone, for example, to start making these vaccines tomorrow. We also have a problem. What we also need is transfer of technology. You need to understand how to work this technology. So a major barrier with expanding vaccine manufacturing is know-how, production know-how, knowing how to run this technology, transfer of cell lines, transfer of know-how. And we need both of these things to happen in parallel to give the legal certainty which manufacturers need, but also to give the actual know-how and technology so that manufacturing capacity can be expanded. The problem we have is that the TRIPS waiver has been blocked through the WTO by a number of high-income countries who do not wish to see this technological capacity transferred to low and middle-income countries. And there's also been some recent concerns expressed around essentially technology security, where there are concerns about this technology being accessible by manufacturers based in China and Russia.
Got it. Dushni, I understand that there may be a manufacturer in Bangladesh, is that right, who is saying that they have excess capacity that's unused?
Well, I think to some extent, I think Mark has explained that, it's Bangladesh has a growing pharmaceutical industrial base, but whether they have the technological know-how and capacity to enter into vaccination production, I am not very certain, but I have seen quite a lot of Bangladeshi pharmaceutical producers, manufacturers saying, well, give us the licenses, we can do it. So I think the concern also is that if you do away with some of the TRIPS and get waivers on them, the cost implications are also there, that they'd be a little more affordable, as well as increasing capacity. So the alternative to not having access to those licenses is that they are now trying to innovate and produce vaccinations themselves. And that's a process that's going to take a very, very long time. And quite frankly, time is of essence. So I think to that extent, the motion by India and South Africa to get a waiver so that third parties can be licensed to produce was to ensure that they can provide these vaccinations at a cheaper cost as well to low and middle income countries. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening because for many of these vaccine producers, they have to get a return on their investments, even though a lot of public money from rich countries have actually gone in rather than private funds.
Let's turn to vaccine hesitancy. One of the things that we've seen in certainly the countries with access to vaccines is that the worse your outbreak, the keener people are to take the vaccines. I mean, I wonder, as we reflect on a year where, towards the end of the year, we may have 10 billion doses of vaccine, I wonder if you could kind of reflect on the extent to which in your region you think that vaccine hesitancy is going to play a role in causing problems for, health systems in the rollout. Maybe I'll turn to you, Amma.
Yes, so currently we haven't had the devastating deaths for COVID as other regions. And so we do have quite a number of people willing to take the vaccines, which is very encouraging. Within about a month when we got the COVAX facility in Ghana, we had done quite a number of vaccinations. And this is because historically in Ghana, we are used to taking vaccines right from birth. So you have the BCG, you have yellow fever, you have quite a number of vaccines that you are taking through your lifetime. And so vaccines are not, they don't pose a challenge in themselves really. And quickly the Ghana Health Service and the Ministry of Health had policies in place to communicate that this was effective and it was to help boost our economy and get back our economy to where it was supposed to be. So I think that the hesitancy will come when we continue to see delays in the second doses being released and the information around what happens to those who had the first dose and there's no second dose. So we really need to quickly work on that kind of messaging to encourage people to go for the next dose when it comes. That for me is the key, the messaging around the second dose and availability.
And Dushni, thank you. Dushni, do you see much of a problem down the line with vaccine hesitancy?
World Bank carried out a survey across South Asia on vaccine uptake, and they've said their results suggest it's pretty good. It ranges from a low of about 65%, and that's Pakistan, to a high of about 85% of the population in countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So the initial sort of engagement with the vaccination process, I think for South Asia is pretty good. Now, going forward, I see some problems, and two things. One is related to the fact that we had got used to the AstraZeneca as the sort of vaccine of choice, and that the frontline workers and the initial doses were administered, and now we are not receiving the stock. So alternative options are being looked at. So now there is a mix and match of vaccination from Russia alongside AstraZeneca. So there's some degree of confusion. And second is we are also receiving media reports on blood clots related to certain vaccinations and concerns that some of these vaccinations have side effects. So there I see a problem because there will be, and I know from anecdotal evidence, I know that people are raising questions. Well, is it safe? Do we need to take it? Second issue, and this is I think a little specific to certain countries, is that there is also the vaccination sort of, diplomacy and donations, and there is pressure on some medical regulatory authorities to fast track approvals. For instance, Sri Lanka's offer of donations of vaccines developed in China. But there was delays in terms of the medical regulatory authorities signing off on it. But the government was very keen to accept this 600,000 of vaccines that were gifted. So it's come into the country, but Sri Lankans are not queuing up to get that vaccination. So, it's becoming more complex as we go along. So by year end, I really don't know whether we would still say that 85% of the population is queuing up to get its vaccines, or, that level of confidence is going to be much lower.
Well, hopefully the WHO will come in with a decision on the Chinese vaccines in the near future, which would hopefully raise confidence. Carlos, let me turn to you. Do you have any views on vaccine hesitancy in Colombia?
Let me address for some seconds a thing that Mark and Dushni touched before about IP. And then I go to your question. So just to put it in frame, how I think we are understanding it, this discussion. The whole IP discussion, let's say, behaves to what we call the research and innovation system or ecosystem in the country. So first, it is this issue of vaccine is part of a higher level issue, which is health security. So currently we are discussing an act of a healthcare reform, and this healthcare includes a whole chapter regarding health security, and it means how to secure for future situations like this the provision and the, let's say, secureness of healthcare professionals. Big issue in everywhere. So new measures how to put it right and to make it work. Issues related to, of course, pharma and vaccine, etc. Issues related to supplies, general supplies, oxygen. Right now we are having shortages in oxygen and many other things. Issues related to facilities. So I think that this kind of comprehensive view and understanding on the health of a health issue is the right approach to involve the discussion. It's not only vaccine, it's not only pharma, it's the whole issue of health. First thing. And the second thing is that at the same time, there's a whole proposal for IP system strengthening, which is it's going to be presented in the next couple of months. It's a compass, it's a policy, a whole policy strengthening related to IP, and the focus is we understand that we are not living and we are not going to live anymore in independent, autonomous nations in which you can make everything. This issue, and mainly in health, is an interdependent issue. You need to have capacities in the country, but you are going to still be dependent in certain ways on research, on raw materials and production, etc., on the international stage. So you need to be enoughly strength in your country, in your location. You need to have and build capacities, mainly human resource, manufacturing, and many other, let's say, facilities, while also guaranteeing that you are going to be attractive and you are going to be, let's say, make a flow conversation of cooperation between other nations and between public and private. That's the kind of focus, because one of the things we are afraid is that at this stage, many voices saying, okay, we need to stop these things of patents, et cetera, and short it. We need to think not only short it, but also in the long term of the implication and make it readiness and learn lessons for the future.
So I'm going to try and wrap this amazing discussion up a little bit, and I'd like you all to just perhaps think about what lessons you have learned personally for the future out of this pandemic about preparing for the next one. And I wonder if you could perhaps tell me in 1 point or 2 points very quickly what those are. I'm going to turn to you first, Mark.
So I think one of the most important things we can take out of this is that the systems like COVAX needed to be in place before emergencies happened, rather than trying to put them together whilst responding to an outbreak. So preparedness is as much needs to be about systems rather than just about strengthening individual healthcare.
Dushni, I wonder if you could comment.
Actually, I would just reiterate what Mark said, because I think the issue goes to the heart of global governance on equity, and if we don't have the mechanisms and processes in place, we will face the next pandemic in the same way. So I think, to me also, the priority is to be prepared. At national level, we can do our bit, but at the multilateral level, these things have to be sorted through efforts from all corners of the world.
Amma.
So I think I'd go with what Mark and Dushni have said, looking at the role of multilateral agencies in this whole process. We have seen certain failures, especially from the WHOs and the multilateral agencies that we thought would make sure there would be equitable access to vaccines if it came to push. So again, how do we strengthen these multilateral agencies to ensure that these processes happen? And how much faith can we have in these multilateral agencies? The gaps are very visible. And within our own continent, we also see the drive to come together as one, to work at scale, to push for one voice in this whole process. You can't do it alone as a country. And we can see how important these collaborations and partnerships are becoming going forward. Thanks.
And lastly, Carlos.
Well, I would say that we really need to celebrate the kind of new cooperation initiative and mechanism that have been developed in this situation. We will, of course, need to be absolutely convinced that we need to build on them and be ready for the next big situation that the world faces. But definitely, I think that we need to celebrate the fastness and the quality of the results from researchers and development of solutions, the quality of the efforts that governments, multilateral agencies have done, the involvement of industry. But I think that we need to deeply reflect on the behavior of the individuals. We need to talk a lot more about behavioral economics of health and the way people have behaved in this pandemic as part of the solution, as part and responsible of health. Today, this day, Wednesday, the worst number of new cases and death, and the third wave is definitely the worst, in the worst situation in our country. 100% occupancy of ICUs in most of the big cities, and we are having the largest street riots and manifestations of unions of different people, teachers, etc., manifesting against the government. That is going to be definitely devastating for the health system in a couple, 2 or 3 weeks after we have this issue. So we need to learn a lot and to talk about the individual responsibility in healthcare issues, not only focus on blaming and asking responses from governments, politicians, industry, and we are not asking what has been my mistake and what I could done better during all this issue.
Well, that's an interesting thought to end on. I'm hearing, notes of optimism about the multilateral potential of the future, but also a reminder from you, Carlos, that actually there are many levels of society that have a responsibility to act and also to prepare for the next pandemic, don't they? Well, look, we could continue the discussion all afternoon. That's all the time we have, I'm afraid. You will find more information about our panelists today on the website, so please do go and check out their work. And please, let's continue this conversation afterwards about vaccine equity, because as you can see, there's many opportunities for us to do better. If you would like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag is hashtag RSA vaccine. And thank you again to Amma, Mark, Dushni and Carlos for joining us. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.